The scene live in central London as police try to contain a small number of activists who have been causing some trouble through the day. There have been a small number of attacks on businesses, all accused of corporate greed or tax avoidance. Good evening. It was far from the usual suspects. Up to 500,000 people from all sorts of backgrounds came from across the country to demand an alternative to the cuts. What that alternative should be, they disagree on. Some reject all the cuts. The Labour leader Ed Miliband said there had to be some, but not so many, so quickly, comparing his call to the civil rights and anti-apartheid movements.
Martin Luther King said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, and it bends towards justice, but only if people bend it that way."
How you judge today depends what your vantage point was. The march was overwhelmingly peaceful, but a breakaway group of activists attempted a trail of destruction. We'll have how that is playing out in a moment. But first, here's our Home Affairs correspondent, Andy Davis, on the biggest demonstration in London since the Iraq War protest.
Mid-morning in an overcast London, they made their way in by foot, by bus, even by boat. They assembled along the banks of the Thames, among them radiographers, casino workers, communists, nurses. This, without question, the biggest political protest in the UK since the anti-war rally of 2003. Jubilant trade unionists handed out vuvuzelas and whistles, and the drumming began. They had come from all over Britain, the TUC mobilising almost all of its 55 affiliated unions for a march it has spent months planning.
Cornwall.
Barnsley, South Yorkshire.
Lincolnshire, Grantham.
South London, of course.
We've come from Dorking.
Where have you come from today?
The Isle of Wight.
London.
I'm from Chiswick in London.
Cheshire.
Oxford. Glasgow.
It was difficult to judge numbers. Organisers said around 250,000 joined in. Even after 3 hours, there were still people waiting to start. Outside Downing Street, a Trojan horse tried gamely perhaps to get past the gates. In Whitehall, it was a sea of flags and banners dotted with the ubiquitous placards which railed against the government's programme of public spending cuts.
People are angry. Look at how many people are here. They are so angry because they are fed up with the government thinking that we're mugs, taking us for granted.
That's affecting me both medically, they're affecting me as my pension has been cut, it's affecting us benefits that you might be able to claim, you can't claim anymore.
They're trying to transform British society in the interest of the few.
What the TUC has achieved here today represents an immensely powerful political statement. But remember, this wasn't called a march against cuts, it was called a march for the alternative. And therein, perhaps, lies the greatest challenge for those people marching here today, to articulate what exactly that alternative is, one which they can all agree upon, and one which has economic credibility. Some on this largely very good-natured main march said tax the rich, others said target the banks, others just singled out cutting Trident. A broad coalition with a vast array of often muddled views on what would replace this government's approach to tackling national debt.
A friendly message to the Labour Party and our Labour MPs. We need a strong, powerful opposition. We need you now on the barricades with us, fighting for an alternative.
At the Hyde Park rally this afternoon, the end point of the protest, came the big political speeches. Much was made of the fact that the Labour leader Ed Miliband had decided to stand beside the unions today, but notably he avoided any focus on his own party's policy that some public spending cuts are imperative.
We come in the tradition of those who have marched before us. The suffragettes who fought for votes for women and won. The civil rights movement. The civil rights movement in America, who fought for equality and won. The anti-apartheid movement, who fought the horror of that system and won.
The TUC had predicted this would be its biggest event in decades, and today it delivered on that promise.
Andy Davis. Well, our political editor Gary Gibbon spent most of the day with the protesters, but is here now. So, first of all, Ed Miliband, he shared a platform with union leaders who say no to all cuts. and there was trouble in London as he was speaking. How's this going to work out for him?
Yeah, he was taking a risk. He always knew he was taking a risk with going to this rally. It's not the sort of thing his brother probably would have done if he'd won. It's certainly not what Tony Blair would have done. He is gambling that, what have we had, about 10% of the cuts so far actually probably implemented, that if you can get this many people when you've got 10% of the cuts implemented, imagine how that movement is going to grow. The number of people who are dissatisfied, unhappy, anxious. He wants to be at the head of that movement, not somewhere lurking behind. So he's gambling that connecting with those people early on will do him more benefit than the harm, which undoubtedly will happen a bit because of some of the images that come out of today.
He compared a campaign to half the deficit in 4 years instead of cutting it completely in 4 years with the civil rights movement, the apartheid struggle. How did that go down?
Yes, Hyde Park, Alabama. It went down terrifically well with the people who were there demonstrating the rally. I was standing close to a couple of left-wing commentators there who blanched a little and their eyes bulged out. You say that sort of thing when you're in front of a whole load of adoring people waving banners. It's one of the dangers of standing there. It doesn't always look quite so good when it's on a TV screen in your room.
And what will the government make of it?
Well, I think they're going to be rubbing their hands together. Obviously, no government would say it would want to see people smashing up windows, but the idea, as Ed Miliband was saying there, that you were seeing mainstream Britain. They will say some mainstream Britain, and they'll want people to see those images of the smashed windows and Ed Miliband make the connection in their mind and see him as a rabble-rouser. Now, those people were nothing to do with what was going on in the park. And the park was a completely different atmosphere, utterly isolated from what's been going on in the streets with the action that you can see in images behind you. Nothing to do with it, but they'll be hoping people make that connection, and some people will.
Gary Gibbon. And we'll be speaking to Justine Greening from the government in a moment. Thousands of police were deployed to today's demonstration, but they could not contain a splinter group of masked protesters intent on trouble. They roamed the streets for several hours, smashing windows, scaling buildings, throwing bottles, fireworks, even, say the police, light bulbs filled with ammonia. Our Home Affairs correspondent Simon Israel reports.
Barricaded behind the doors of Topshop, a team of its own security guards were forced to take refuge under a barrage of missiles, mostly paint bombs, but sticks too. This was the other face of protest today, hooded, masked and violent. It prompted the deployment of riot squad officers to guard property on London's busiest shopping street.
This is the first sight today of police in riot gear. It's followed an attack by what are suspected to be anarchist groups on Topshop. And this is the first flashpoint of what has been up till now a mainly peaceful mass demonstration.
What followed was a series of seemingly random assaults on other property in the area. A branch of HSBC was attacked, the windows smashed and the front door rammed with a heavy waste bin. This was breaking and entering before a riot squad arrived. And then the focus turned on the police themselves. Once again, there was the use of a makeshift battering ram. Further random targets included Santander, a jeweller's and the Ritz. As the day wore on and the police waited to react, a small destructive band roamed the streets. They were in the background from the very beginning, when the protesters were gathering in the morning to join the mass demonstration. There was barely a police officer in sight. But 6 hours on, and the mood has darkened considerably. Once again, there's the sight of lines of riot police on the streets. It's a reflection of growing concerns for public safety. Santander is attacked again, in full view this time of the police lines. That triggers a change in police tactics, opting for the last resort, containment, or, as some describe it, kettling. The official march is long over, and a firecracker signals confrontation has begun with various breakaway anarchic groups. Hundreds of officers are now being deployed as reinforcements. The police laid-back approach has now gone.
Simon Israel reporting. With me now, Justine Greening, the Economic Secretary to the Treasury. And the truth is, today's not going to make any difference to you, is it? You're not changing course.
We're not going to change course, but we do understand, and we feel as passionately
but not
about
that much,
public
because you're not going to
services.
change your policy.
We feel as passionately about public services as many of the people protesting today. What we need to do is make sure that we put public services on a sustainable footing financially, and that's one of the reasons why we've got to go through the deficit reduction plan over the next few years.
But you reject their call for an alternative, straightforwardly. It's not going to happen.
Well, I think clearly today, as you pointed out in your earlier package, it's not clear what that alternative is. I think that people today have certainly been let down by Ed Miliband, who turned up at a rally with no alternative.
Well, he did. I mean, his alternative is clear. He says half the deficit in 4 years. That's his alternative.
Well, what's interesting was Labour's plan prior to the election was that they would be cutting back public spending by 14 billion this year. We're in the coalition government doing it by 16 billion. So there's 2 billion of difference there, but Labour has still not actually set out that 14 billion of cuts. And I think if they were really honest with the public sector workers today who are out on that march and other people, they really ought to start doing that now.
You don't join those people attacking him for being on the protest today as irresponsible?
Well, I think he clearly makes his own decisions. I think what really matters to the country is the route that we're going down to start getting our public finances back into order. Ed Miliband clearly wants to airbrush his role in getting us into this mess completely out of the picture. I think that's totally disingenuous. But what matters is actually the fact we are on the road to recovery.
Okay, well,
and we will see job creation over the coming term of this Parliament that will get more people back into work. And let's not forget that Labour left it 400,000 higher unemployment than when they came into office.
All right, but let's stick to the day. If there were 500,000 people today and you're going to ignore them, how many people does it take before you listen? 1 million? 2 million? How many people?
We are listening to people up and down the country. We're listening on things like cost of living. That's one of the reasons why you saw in the budget last week as cutting fuel duty rather than allowing it to rise. We're absolutely listening. The other thing clearly, though, that we need to do, and many people on the march were talking about that, is make sure we kickstart the economy and get jobs being created. The budget was all about creating jobs. We've got to get manufacturing back on its feet again and grow that. There's a whole range of steps that we're going to be taking as government to put the economy back on its feet, to create the jobs and to make sure that public services are never again going to be put on a completely unsustainable footing by a government that's run the economy so recklessly.
Thank you very much for coming in. Tonight's main news, scuffles are continuing between police and breakaway demonstrators in central London tonight after around 500,000 people from across the country took part in a rally against public spending cuts through the streets of London. We're back tomorrow at 6:30. Until then, that's Channel 4 News. Have a very good evening.